Welcome. This is Barry Lank from the Eastsider, and we're interviewing Nithya Raman, candidate for City Council for City Council District 4. Nithya, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Barry, for having me.
Good.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. We have a number of questions. Some came from our readers. Some were sort of put together out of different things the readers sent in. And the first one I think we'll tackle is really the big one for the city, the approach you want to take with homelessness over the next 4 years.
Yeah.
What can we do that we haven't done already?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can do differently with regards to homelessness here. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think we need to do is to actually stop one of the approaches that we've been taking here in Los Angeles, which has been primarily one of responding to homelessness with police first, with criminalization first. Mm-hmm. We have spent a lot of time in LA arresting people who are homeless and spent countless millions of dollars on that approach. What I've talked about in my housing and homelessness policy, which is on my website, and I encourage all of the viewers and readers of this interview to take a look at it, is to actually rethink how we deliver a response on homelessness, how we rethink delivering services for people who are homeless much more effectively. So what I'm proposing, rather than what we are doing now, is to lead with outreach and services first, and to make sure that we are providing that outreach and services at the neighborhood level. So I've talked about developing a set of neighborhood level access centers where outreach workers and mental health caseworkers are housed at the neighborhood level, where they are tasked with proactive outreach to people who are experiencing homelessness in that area, tasked with knowing every person experiencing homelessness in that area by name, and and actually being held accountable for moving those individuals along what is often a very complex path from living in an encampment to actually getting into a shelter or into a home, or getting access to services like mental health treatment or rehab or any of the other things that I think people really need who are experiencing homelessness right now.
Well, this gets us, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. To me, this would be a much more effective response, one that really, I think, will help us reduce the number of people who are living on the streets over time, and will get people effectively into services and housing. I think there's more to do on two other fronts, which I just wanted to talk about too. Sure. One is that I think we need to expand places where people can go and live. We need to have more shelter beds available for folks. We need to have more housing available for folks. And so far in Los Angeles, we have invested more in those in recent years, but I think we've invested in those in ways that have been fairly inefficient, very, very expensive, and very slow. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot that we can do as a city, even learning from other departments that are close by, like the County Department of Health Services, to think about how we can provide those homes and those shelter beds more cheaply, more effectively, and more quickly in response to the burgeoning amount of need. The final thing that I'll say is that I think that we need to do much better at making sure people are able to stay housed. That to me means two kinds of things. One is expanding and really empowering people to stay in their homes. Right now, that would mean providing a lawyer for everyone who's facing eviction as a right in the city. We haven't done that. We've done that somewhat under COVID now. It was just announced, but we should be doing far more of that, providing emergency rental assistance to a far greater number of people than we currently do. Research shows that often people who are facing eviction need as little as $600 to stay in their homes. That's the average. And that, to me, that's a kind of response that we could be doing much more effectively, and enforcing tenant protections that are on the books, but right now are not being proactively enforced by the city at all. We don't have a proactive system of tenant rights enforcement at all. We don't have a comprehensive registry of rental units in the city. And even the limited registry that we do have, we don't use that to tell landlords about their obligations and the resources available to them, or to tell tenants about the laws and the resources available to them. And finally, I think we could do much, much better at really building the kind of deeply affordable housing that we so desperately need in LA. And I have outlined some ways of doing that in our existing housing and homelessness policy. And we're actually going to be releasing more updates on what that policy could look like at the local level that I think would really generate a lot more units, and a lot more units that look like what we really need here in LA.
Well, that gets us into the issue of housing and also finding a balance between, because, you know, whenever somebody wants to put up a housing, any kind of housing complex, whether it's affordable or not, inevitably we're going to run up against people who are against the style of it, who feel that it doesn't fit into the neighborhood. So how do you sort of find the balance there between more housing and neighborhood character?
I think that's a really important question to think about. We, right now, the way we've proposed building affordable housing units, particularly, let's talk about homeless housing, because that's something that I think is a big topic in LA right now, and something that faces a lot of resistance as, you know, as units are being built or as shelters are being built. Right now, we do it one project at a time. And, you know, we have very few projects that are on the anvil. I think what we could be doing is thinking about how we use all of the resources available to us as a city, including city-owned properties. We have 7,500 city-owned properties, which include a number of very little used parking lots, for example. We have a lot of housing units that are dilapidated or could be rehabbed. There are all kinds of units, motels and hotels now that are, because of COVID, are you know, really kind of not financially viable anymore. What I would want to do as a council person is to look at every single opportunity available to me in the district, to look too at places where there is a gap between what is already built and what could be the full built capacity of those plots, and to see where can we actually invite our nonprofit partners in, where can we invite affordable housing developers in across the district, and to come up with a range of options so that we can push forward with a lot of them. And where there is resistance and where those projects move more slowly, we can, you know, think about what we do there, but we can also think about how we actually generate as many options as possible with all of the opportunities available to us. I also really do think that we have in Los Angeles, you know, I think along our big transit corridors, in our commercial corridors, for example, where we have very little housing built right now, and which will look really different as a result of COVID. You know, I think those commercial corridors are going to sadly look very, very different because of what has happened in recent months, including some offices that I think will never look the same again, you know, once people have been working from home for a long time. These are all opportunities, I think, where we can think about how can we use these, you know, these places, these portions of the city to really, again, rethink how we can address our most important housing need, which is deeply affordable and affordable housing.
Yeah. Getting into sort of the impact of COVID, the city, of course, is facing a fiscal emergency at the moment. I have sort of a trick question, essentially. Where can we spend money less? Where can we actually save the money? As opposed to, we know where we need it more, but where can we cut it?
You know, I think one of the reasons we are in as much of a fiscal crisis as we are in right now is because even before COVID, the city was actually looking at making cuts across basic services, the things that we most need and that we need even more now because of COVID. And the reason why we were looking at those cuts was because we had made some decisions around expanding, for example, increasing salaries for a number of city employees, but primarily going to the police. And I think we were already in a place where we were facing some real fiscal issues at the city. And I think when we think about how we are going to ideally make as few cuts as possible in the kinds of essential services that are all the more essential now, I think we should be looking at some of these contracts. There was a vote recently to bring some of those contracts back to the table to see if we can postpone those rate increases, the salary increases. And I think that's definitely something that's worth doing. We need to be thinking about where we can push some of those expenditures off and invest much more deeply in what is so essential to the city right now.
And the COVID The COVID response itself, the city's COVID response itself, how might we be doing things differently with that?
I think that we as a city, each particular program has has some issues that have played out as they have kind of rolled out. And I think each individual program, we could look at how those programs could be far more effectively implemented and spent. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, for example, in the small business loans that were provided or small business grants that were provided. There was a set of funds. That fund has not been even fully spent yet. There were tens of thousands of applications for those funds. Very few businesses were actually provided access to those funds. We don't have a lot of transparency into what that process was, what made certain businesses eligible and what made other ones not eligible. And I think really making sure that we're spending out that money right now when people need it the most, that is what's going to shore up residents and small businesses to survive through this crisis, so that when we get the vaccine, what I want for LA is that when that vaccine comes and when we are ready to get back into our normal economy, that people are whole and people are able to get back into that full economy as healthy as they can be. And so I would be looking at every single element of our response and making sure that we are doing it as effectively as possible. Are we spending all of the money that we have available to us on those issues? And where could we be spending that money in ways that make sure that our most vulnerable residents are shored up during this time?
Yeah. Let's turn to the topic of law enforcement. I mean, the big question, who do you support in the district attorney's race? And what changes do you want to make in law enforcement and our approach to it?
I think, I've been a supporter of Gascon since in the general election, and I think that's who we should be voting for as a city. In terms of our approach to law enforcement, I have a fairly detailed public safety policy on my website that I again invite readers and watchers of this interview to take a look at. That public safety platform starts with a premise, which is right now in Los Angeles, we send out armed police to do a range of things for which armed police response in many cases are not necessary, and in some ways are inappropriate or even harmful for those situations. I'm thinking of things like calls for service around mental health crisis. I'm thinking of things like calls for service around complaints around homeless encampments, which take up a huge amount of police officers' time. Thinking about how we respond to traffic collisions and who comes out to take a report after traffic collision. All of these are places where I think we could invest in trained responders for these issues who have the skills to respond to them, but even more so, could actually be able to address the root cause of some of those calls for service. Like in the case of homelessness, we could be sending out outreach workers, people who have the ability to deal with mental health issues, and potentially when they go out in calls for service about homeless encampments could actually be supporting people who are experiencing homelessness to get back into housing, to end the condition that initiated that call for service in the first place. And I think if we were to do that, not only would it be cheaper than our current response, but we would actually be effectively addressing the cause of that call for service in the first place.
Okay. Both you and Councilman Ryu also talk about the environmental issues of Los Angeles. The environment is a very broad topic, and Los Angeles certainly has plenty of problems. Where would you want to put your focus in this area?
So in the environment, the way I've approached environmental issues is to think about the local level, our city as a site of ambitious response to climate crisis. And Los Angeles is kind of unique because we have as a city actually a number of places where we can take rapid action that will have big impacts. So Los Angeles has its own Department of Water and Power, which is a publicly owned utility. So we could, and that's a unique asset, by the way, many cities don't have access to that. They're contracting with a private provider for that. What we could be doing is telling our DWP that we need to get to 100% renewables by 2030. Right now, we've set that deadline 15 or 20 years after that. And to me, that really does not reflect the urgency of this moment. This is something that climate researchers and energy policy researchers have said is very much possible for the city of Los Angeles to do. And I would be wanting to use all of these various tools to make sure that we're getting to our climate goals as quickly as possible. We also have other tools at our disposal. The Port of LA is under the control of the city, and it's poised to be the largest source of emissions in Los Angeles very soon. And I think we could be tightening emissions requirements at the port from all of the people who are involved in port activities, rather than loosening them as we have been doing in recent months in LA.
Okay, they're certainly one of our largest employers. Moving on to City Hall corruption. The charges against former Councilman Jose Huizar have brought that into the spotlight. Background for our listeners, Huizar faces a trial next year of 34 counts involving racketeering. What specifically would it take to reform City Hall?
I think that we have a City Hall which has not only had open cases of corruption. It's not just Jose Huizar, it's also Mitch Englander, who resigned before the FBI charged him. We haven't, I think we've had in recent years some really, really blatant cases of corruption with kind of cinematic episodes of people being given bags of money in Las Vegas casinos. Yep. But I think that corruption in Los Angeles often takes a much more prosaic form. It is in the form of influence peddling, just regular old influence peddling. And in Los Angeles, for city council races in the past, what we've seen is that for many city council candidates, the bulk of their money is coming from corporations or others who, real estate interests, from fossil fuel interests, who are really seeking to profit from control over City Hall decision-making. I think the most important thing for Los Angeles is to push towards publicly financed elections. I think that would make a huge change in terms of the ways in which City Hall officials were responding to those interests that seek to profit off of the city. I think it would make sure that they were far better able to balance commercial interests and the needs and most urgent priorities of residents in a much more effective way. I also think we could be doing far more to shore up our existing system of enforcement and oversight at the city. We have an ethics commission that depends on the city council for its funding. Let's fund that ethics commission. Let's make sure that it's not going back to City Hall to beg for its funding. We need to make sure that the ethics commission can do its job in a timely fashion, and I'm a big proponent of that. I also wanted to say one other thing, which is, even as a candidate, you can say no to corporate donations, which is something that we have done in our campaign. We've only raised money from individuals. We don't even have a button on our website for corporations to be able to donate to us. And I think that that's something that we don't have to wait for City Hall policymakers to take action on. We can, as candidates, just say that we are not doing that. And that's really, I think that's a big part of how we can get a better kind of system of governance here in Los Angeles.
We have one last question. This is a direct quote from a reader. The condition of the streets in Silver Lake and surrounding areas is terrible, most garnering an F rating. Little progress has been made. What will you do to get some of these streets repaved? Our cracked, broken old streets. What do you think?
It's not just limited to Silver Lake. It's a problem across the district. Everywhere I've gone, neighborhood after neighborhood, this has been a complaint that has come up over and over again. Streets and sidewalks. Sidewalks are also very much broken, cracked, et cetera, et cetera. What I think we need to be doing is drawing lessons from past economic recessions that we have had in LA. What happened, for example, during the Great Recession was that we cut a lot of our essential city services here in Los Angeles. We cut tree maintenance, which has really impacted both our streets and our sidewalks. We cut a lot of the money that we were putting towards resurfacing streets and maintaining our sidewalks. I think that we should be prioritizing these essential services and making sure that we are looking at our budget in a much more holistic way. What we've done in LA is, instead of responding to issues proactively, preventatively, using regular maintenance, We have instead waited until we hit the point of crisis, until streets are so broken that we are sued. And now we are on the hook for over $1 billion settlement to actually be able to fix these sidewalks over the next few years. This is short-sighted. I think we really need to be thinking about doing maintenance proactively and making sure that we protect the budget, even as we are looking at reduced budgets over the future because we have less revenues coming in because of COVID.
Well, that's thank you very much for coming by. That's it for me. I've been talking to Nithya Raman. She is a candidate for City Council District 4. Nithya, thank you for talking to us and good luck.
Thank you so much, Barry. It was a pleasure.